Okay, we're live. So, dear viewers, welcome to another special episode of InvestPRO Talks, where we discuss various investment options, strategies, and tactics with prominent investors and thought leaders in finance from around the world. Today, me and my co-host George Manolo from Nexo, without whom this talk wouldn't be possible, have the pleasure to welcome a very special guest from the US with whom we talk about Bitcoin and crypto. So our guest describes himself as a Bitcoin developer, educator, and entrepreneur whose mission is to bring sound money to the world. He's an expert in Bitcoin and has been an advocate for the last 11 years. He's worked on and invested in many different Bitcoin projects and has been lecturing as a professor in the University of Texas. He's also a Christian, and a lot of his work is explaining the immorality of the current monetary system. He's a co-author of the little book about Bitcoin, which we already have translated in Bulgarian. We'll talk about it after a while, which has been one of the most popular books for Bitcoin beginners globally. And if you're a crypto fan and want to learn more about it, so more about Bitcoin, more about crypto, I suggest you fasten your seatbelts because I'm sure our guests will share a lot of wisdom with us in the next hour or so. So without further ado, let's welcome Jimmy Song. Jimmy, welcome to the show. We're pleased to have you with us today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be on. It's always awesome knowing how global Bitcoin actually is.
Oh, yeah, definitely. So, Jimmy, could you share with us how you first bumped into Bitcoin? Why you fall in love with its idea and how it turned out to be that for the ambassador and educator, but also an active builder and investor in the space. What makes Bitcoin special?
Well, that's a lot there. Let's start with where I got started. It was in 2011 when I read a story on a tech news website called Slashdot, and the headline of that story was something like "Internet-only currency Bitcoin has reached dollar parity," and I didn't know what that meant. I was very confused. I was like, "Wait, there's an internet-only currency?" And I looked into it. I found out more about it, and I learned about the 21 million limit. And almost immediately, I was like, "Oh, I better be one of the first people to get this, and not one of the last, in case it gains any traction whatsoever." So that's how I found out about it in 2011. Of course, it was much more difficult to go get Bitcoins at the time. So I actually didn't end up getting any. And the price had just reached $1. So it's significantly more now. And, you know, everyone has their Bitcoin regret story about how they didn't get into Bitcoin the first time they heard about it. Well, that's mine. I didn't get into it when it was $1. A couple of years later in 2013, I started getting much more into it as a developer. I'm a coder by trade. I program a lot. And I started learning a lot more about the internals and how it all worked and so on. And you asked me like how I fell in love with it. Well, I realized that it fixes a lot of the problems of the current monetary system. If you ever try to send a little bit of money to somebody. I mean, at least back then, it was a lot more difficult. Nowadays, we have like Venmo, Cash App, and all this other stuff because Bitcoin has existed. You know, they're realizing there's some room to do similar things in the traditional fiat system. So I realized fairly early that it was in alignment with all of my values, especially because I do tend to be very libertarian. So, you know, after 2008, I realized like the government was just spending so much money that it didn't have. So for me, Bitcoin was that ideal money. And that's why I started getting into it. I started programming for some open source projects related to Bitcoin. And eventually I got to the point where I was making, I was writing books and I was speaking at conferences. I was making YouTube videos, writing a lot of articles. So all of that came as a result of just trying to explain really what Bitcoin was to people. And that's what this book is about.
And we thank you very much for this book, Jimmy, because indeed this type of compressed knowledge is and easily approachable knowledge is really what so many people out there need, because it takes a particular type of person to kind of like dive deep into Bitcoin and understand it. But we also need to have all of this information, super easily understandable. Now, one of the kind of major topics that Bitcoin is addressing is working towards fixing is obviously the thing that is so normal in these days, and that is inflation, right? So inflation has been ever present, right? Especially like all over the world, some places less, other places more. But in particular here in Bulgaria, where we are, it has actually risen quite a lot in the past year or so, especially in the past few months. Like literally, we've been having unprecedented times in the sense that people have been looking at how their earnings are literally melting before their eyes. And not just in Bulgaria, but outside of Bulgaria, we've been looking at unprecedented times. Like, for example, just a month or so ago, we saw how regular citizens in Canada got their bank accounts frozen, right? Something that they thought was theirs turned out not to be theirs. Then a little later, we saw the foreign currency reserves of the largest energy producer globally, Russia, to get frozen again. I really think, this is probably one of the first time, if not the first time in history that pretty much all people almost all over the globe are experiencing simultaneously double-digit annual real inflation, right? And it seems that Bitcoin has something to offer in these type of problems to the people. What's your view on inflation and in general as to kind of like how Bitcoin takes a different look at this sort of normal thing in our society?
Yeah, inflation's been sort of like an ever-present reality since fiat money came, and fiat money is, at least in the modern form, central bank-backed currency. So the central bank decides how much of that money there's going to be. And this is how they make up for budget deficits. Almost in every country that experiences a lot of inflation, the governments are spending way more money than they're taking in. So in the US, for example, the yearly budget is somewhere around 6 trillion. The revenue from taxes is around 4 trillion or something like that. The gap has to be made up. And this is where the central bank comes in and provides that money. And it's supposed to be paid back, but they just keep getting the deficit to be bigger and bigger, and it never really gets paid back. And that happens in every country. Whenever you have the central bank-backed fiat monetary system, inflation is kind of inevitable because of the monetary expansion. Inflation is, always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. The more dollars or whatever currency that's local to you there is, the higher the prices are going to be because more currency is chasing fewer goods. The reason why Bitcoin is so effective against inflation is that there's a fixed supply. There's no central bank that gets to expand the monetary supply. And that's a huge thing. If you look at the last time we had some sort of like hard money standard, this was back in like 1900 or so. The entire world was on the gold standard. Everybody used gold as what money was, and your local currency could be converted to gold at any time. You just use the cash bills because they were more convenient. So, for example, in the United States, $20.67 would get you 1 ounce of gold. And in Europe, I'm sure it was different depending on whatever currency you happen to have. But everybody was on the gold standard, so your currency could be traded for gold at any time, which meant that governments had to adhere to stricter budgets because you could only spend the taxes that you got and not additional money that gets printed by the central bank. But that's why Bitcoin is so effective, because it has that hard cap 21 million supply. And that means that for a lot of people, this is a great hedge against the inflation that's coming. And you mentioned how inflation has been hitting especially hard in Bulgaria over the last 4 months. Well, if you look around the world, that's the case almost everywhere, including the U.S. We just had an inflation print of 7.9%, which in the U.S. is absolutely insane. Those are not numbers that we've seen since the 80s. And this was when the rates were purposefully raised up so that monetary tightening could happen. So, we had 2 years basically of the world shut down, and the governments around the world essentially printed money to make up for the fact that there wasn't any actual economic activity going on. Everyone had to stay home because of this virus and so on. So that means that we're going to have to pay the piper, and that's going to be in the form of higher prices, which are pretty much everywhere. I think Bulgaria is actually kind of getting off easy. If you look at places like Turkey or Lebanon or Nigeria, inflation's like 30, 40, 50, 100% per year. Those are some crazy numbers. And if your wealth is sort of like diminishing that fast, and you get very close to hyperinflation, which if you study any hyperinflationary episodes are not fun for anybody. It is extremely depressing. A lot of commentators say that it's actually worse psychologically than war, because at least with war, you are winning sometimes, losing at other times. With hyperinflation, you're just losing all the time. And it's just like a terrible, mentality for a whole country to get into. So yeah, it does seem like inflation is on its way. Bitcoin seems to be our escape valve, and I hope a lot of people, take that into account as they plan for the future.
For sure. Yeah, actually, here in Bulgaria, we are sort of aware of hyperinflation. Back in the not so distant future, when I was rather a small kid, so I don't remember too much, but like in 1997, we experienced hyperinflation here, when basically the national currency devalued by, I think it was like 100 times or something. It was ridiculous.
Oh, wow.
So basically, my parents, most active people at the time, lost pretty much everything. But I think people have sort of forgotten this, or people are still kind of skeptical about Bitcoin, because, and I would love to get your input on the following, because obviously, I talk to friends and people, and I'm saying yeah, you should get some Bitcoin as an inflation hedge, just like you say. But what I hear from a lot of people is well, I would rather have some of my money in stocks, in indexes. Maybe I'll buy some gold. Maybe I'll invest in peer-to-peer lending platforms, for the people who don't have that much savings. Or I'll just buy a couple of more apartments. That's kind of like the normal thing here to do. And when I say hey, what about Bitcoin? Why don't you look at it? They're like, well, Bitcoin was what is it, 60,000 a couple of months ago. Now it's 35 or 40. How can this really be an effective savings tool? So what do you say to this type of thought process?
Yeah, I totally get their concern, because they're looking at the dollar and saying, okay, it's not stable to the dollar, therefore it's not a good store of value. And I sympathize with that, but it's actually not a very valid argument. What people want is something that steadily goes up without any dips or anything. And there's no asset that exists like that. Risk and reward are two sides of the same thing. If without some volatility, you're not going to get the upside. If you want something steady, just keep it in the dollar. That's very steady. And this is a different asset than the dollar. What people seem to want is something that'll go up in price at a very steady rate forever. And that just doesn't exist. So the reason why Bitcoin is so volatile is precisely the reason why you want to get into it. It doesn't have a central bank. So if you think about pretty much every other country with their currency, they have to keep some sort of peg range around the dollar. So for a long time, up until today, the Japanese yen has traded at around 100 yen per dollar for a very long time. I think since sometime in the 80s. Similar thing with the euro. It's been a band around like $1.10 or something like that. The Swiss franc also. So like most currencies make sure that they keep a very small range of prices relative to the dollar for their own currency. And the reason is obvious. It's because if it gets out of band, then either imports are too expensive or exports are too expensive. If the imports are too expensive, then you can't build anything, right? Like you need raw materials from other countries in order to, make whatever it is you're going to make. And if your exports are too expensive, well, you've just destroyed your domestic industry. No one's going to buy it. They're going to buy from somebody else. So in order to like keep being a part of the world market, central banks are sort of tasked with making sure that their currency is within a certain range of the dollar. Now, the way they do that is through monetary policy. So usually if the dollar is too expensive versus their currency, then they will sell the dollars that they have in reserve into the market. And if the dollars are too cheap compared to their currency, then they will print more of their own currency so that you keep it within that band. And this is how every central bank manages to make sure that the companies within their borders are competitive globally. This is the only real way to do it. But that has the effect of keeping sort of these currencies relatively steady to the dollar. But it also means that it doesn't have much upside. For most currencies, it tends to go down over time in value, kind of like the hyperinflationary episode you talked about in Bulgaria. But this happens all over the world, where this devaluation kind of accelerates because they're not, like the Turkish lira is not a global reserve currency like the dollar is. So when they print, it tends to spiral out of control very fast. But that central bank mechanism of keeping it in a peg range is what kind of keeps it steady. Bitcoin does not have that. There's no central bank that says, oh, it's at 60,000, it's too high, we're going to sell some so that, it comes back down. Oh, it's too low, we're going to buy some so that it goes back up. Instead, you have the natural volatility of the market, which is essentially, a lot of buyers and sellers coming in and out for all sorts of reasons. So the volatility is completely natural, whereas the non-volatility of currencies and central banks, that's very unnatural. It's manipulated essentially by central banks. So not having a central bank is the feature, but it also means that there's more volatility. But from a savings perspective, from a store of value perspective, over a period of 5 years or something like that, no one has ever lost money in Bitcoin. Like over 5 years, no one has ever lost money in Bitcoin. And that's what I would call a much better store of value, because you could have something that goes down in value slightly and is very steady, but who wants that versus something that over 5 years doubles, triples, multiplies by 10 or whatever. That to me is a much more interesting thing, and I think most people would agree that's what's missing in the economy, not something that is completely steady all the time. If you want that, just go get the dollar.
True. Yeah, but it's just hard for most people, because we're so used to, just being pampered, being like, yeah, you should not break your legs, you should not break this and that. Everything should be kind of like flowing through life. And I guess that's why people also have these problems, right? And I think almost everyone, like more or less, if you don't have experience with volatile assets, the first time you handle it, you're like, wait, what the hell is going on, right? Like it's hard for people to think in a 5-year perspective or so, because they're looking at every single day, right?
Yeah. This is something that most governments around the world have done, which is to make people feel safer about everything. And it's not necessarily that you are safer, it's that you are made to feel safer just through sort of like steadiness and everything. And most laws are sort of geared around that, where you're meant to feel safe because now there's FDIC insurance on your bank deposits or something like that. Those are, and you know, TSA lines or something, right? Like, oh, at the airport now you're getting, you know, handled by some bureaucrat or something like that. Like it's not actually safer. It's just made to feel safer. Life is a lot more volatile and has a lot more sort of like, you know, uncertainty around it, which a lot of people, it makes people nervous, but that's also where a lot of creativity comes in. And, you know, people figure out ways to, you know, do things that reduce that, or to create new things out of that. Instead, we basically nerfed the entire all of society by making it super safe for everybody, or feel super safe for everybody. But that also means that everybody is much less creative, much less, you know, trying different things or whatever. There's almost no tolerance for risk as a result, and that means that people get very uncomfortable when their portfolio drops 5%. When it's like, if you've been a Bitcoiner, 5% is like Tuesday, you know, like that, who cares? Like, you know, that happens all the time. But you know, if you can't take the 5% drops, then you don't deserve like the 20% gains. Like we've had a pretty nice run over the last couple of days. You know, it's gone up like $3,000 or $4,000. That's almost like 10%. Well, you know, you're not going to get those if you can't handle the drops either. But you know, I realize it's not for everyone, and for those people that aren't comfortable with risk, I mean, the only thing I can tell you is that there's probably a much bigger risk ahead of a complete collapse, in which case, you know, like you minimize volatility locally, then you have giant volatility later, which is what hyperinflation basically is. You know, that's not a good situation to be in, to be caught with your pants down.
Yeah. Would you, how do you look at the kind of like proposition that everyone, even like those who are very risk averse, should have at least some exposure to Bitcoin, even if it's like small, you know, like a few percentage of their portfolio? Do you think this makes sense? Do you think it's still?
Yeah, the thing about having it as a few percentage of your portfolio is that it'll take over your portfolio if you just hold it long enough. Bitcoin started as a very tiny percentage of my portfolio, and it got very large as time went on. That's just kind of how it works. I think that's a perfectly fine way to get it. I would encourage people to get off zero, so own some so you can learn more about it, and that's a good thing.
Okay. And talking about this, I have another question I've been thinking a lot about, which is like you say, okay, you invested a very small part, then it became a huge part, or pretty much all of it, right? Do you think this is still going to be the case? Because there's so many people who are like, yeah, well, Bitcoin is so expensive now, so it will grow, but it won't grow that much. That's one thing people say. That's also why they look into other digital assets that are popping up, you know, around the industry. And I'm also thinking, you know, on a second note, that's like, how quickly is actually Bitcoin going to grow? Because if you look at the internet, let's say, it pretty much changed the world over the span of about 30 years or less. You know, pretty much all of human interaction, business changed. Bitcoin is now, what is it, like 13 years in, right? 13 years in. Would we need, how much time would we need to get to that same amount of impact? Are we still sort of like 20 years away or so? Or are we 10 years, 15, 5?
I mean, your guess is as good as mine. I don't really know. What I do know is that it's already impacting people all over the world already. The fact that you have Bitcoin as this uncensorable store of value means that, you know, people in Venezuela can leave, right? Like with their wealth, they can sell all their stuff for Bitcoin, cross the border into Colombia, and start a new life there. A lot of people have chosen to do exactly that. And, you know, people in the Ukraine and Russia are doing the same thing. They're selling all their stuff for Bitcoin, crossing the border, and going somewhere else to start a new life. That's a significant impact for a lot of people. And it gives people a lot more agency and power, and that's a very good thing. And now, is it going to be like a bigger impact than that? Yeah, I think so. I think eventually we become, or Bitcoin becomes sort of like the world reserve asset or something like that. But that's going to take some time. There are lots of people. It's not like the internet where there was a competing system that was, constantly, trying to suppress it or whatever. It overtook a lot of different things, just because it was just more efficient, and a lot of companies were getting rewarded for moving in that direction and so on. Bitcoin doesn't have that necessarily, because a lot of governments are against it. It is way more efficient in many, many different ways. But it's going to take some time for people to get used to it. It's the big thing about currencies is that, and money in general, is it takes people time to get used to. So when Bitcoin was 5 years old, it had only lasted 5 years. So people were like, okay, is this actually going to last or whatever? The longer it lasts, the more people get comfortable with it. So, is it like the internet? Well, we didn't think that the internet was going to go away anytime soon. Bitcoin is money. So money has this sort of like property where people think way more long-term about it than they do the internet. The internet, it's, hey, I can go on Google and search for something that I need to do or whatever. As a store of value, especially, Bitcoin just requires more time for people to get acquainted with it and learn about it.
Makes sense. All right. Miro, you want to take on?
Yes, Jimmy, I wanted to ask you. You talk about you gave this example about people moving from Venezuela to Colombia with Bitcoin, or Russians going through the border. But I don't know. Probably you are familiar with the legislation that is being brought up to vote this week in the European Parliament, where they will vote something about the unhosted wallets, where all of the companies should give data about their clients. So probably a KYC, know your customer, will be done for many of the companies. You've worked in the industry, so what do you think? Is this a step that would be bad for the industry? Can this follow like a censorship resistant thing? Can, for example, countries first, after they see who has what, probably try to pressure certain companies into adhering to certain laws, and probably suffocating some of the people, some of the investors? What's your take on this?
So the European Parliament thing is a little bit strange to me, because they're trying to regulate something that they really can't. They're saying, oh, you can't use hosted wallets or whatever. Well, people are using hosted wallets all over the place. Two of the biggest hardware wallet vendors are from Europe. You have Ledger, which is out of France, and you have Trezor, which is, I think, out of the Czech Republic. So does it really make sense to make that regulation? It's just sort of like bureaucrats being bureaucrats, and there's a huge movement towards sort of being able to financially censor stuff because of what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. There seems to be this huge push to stop anything Russian, which I think is kind of self-defeating. When you try to censor things, you're just impeding the flow of money, and you're costing people money, essentially. There are people, the vendors, that would love to get paid and stuff like that. You're mucking up the system. Well, then, yeah, that's going to be reflected in the cost of the item or the good or the service that's being provided, because you're essentially taxing this good or service that people want to do. So the European Parliament, to me, they're trying to regulate something that they really don't understand very well, and they're doing it by, saying, hey, we're going to ban this thing or something like that. They could try, and I'm sure they will at some point, but bring it on. Like, try it. Like, let's see what happens with Bitcoin users. If all the exchanges in Europe decide to shut down as a result, we'll see who wins versus Europe versus the US or whatever. I personally think a lot more people will get into Bitcoin as a result of that if that were the case, because then it'd be like, oh, okay, they have no idea how much I have. I'm going to go trade peer-to-peer or something. And this is exactly what happened in China, right? 5 years ago, there were tons of exchanges in China, OKCoin, Huobi, and BTCC, and so on. And what the Chinese government said was, hey, you can't run these exchanges anymore. It's bad. We don't have enough control, and so on. And what happened was people started using local Bitcoins, which was peer-to-peer, trading of Bitcoin and buying and selling and so on. And they banned that website too. And then what the Chinese users do, they went and created their own Telegram and WeChat groups, and that's how they traded. So like, you could try to ban stuff, and I'm sure they'll try, but bring it on, try it. Like, it's not going to work because ultimately there's no middleman. There's no trusted third party. And if you just ban exchanges, it's just going to add more cost, but people are going to, want it even more because it's uncensorable money. If you're planning to, if it's held at an exchange or something like that, and that's the only way you can get it, well, what happens if the exchange goes down? What are you going to do, right? Like, that's happened many, many times in Bitcoin's history, where an exchange became insolvent because the Bitcoins got stolen or embezzled or something. So yeah, they can try it. I welcome their challenge. Bring it on. I think that would be fantastic for Bitcoin price if they do.
One follow-up question. Don't you think that the application layer, the Web 2, so-called, is a vulnerability for the mass adoption of the Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies? Because when I'm thinking about the user experience, we are very proud that the crypto users, Bitcoin users, wallets numbers are growing, and more people are using the currency. But don't you think that this is because of good user experience, good wallets, more exchanges, more who facilitate actually the easier exchange? And all of those applications are actually hosted on the infrastructure of American companies. Sorry. For example, Apple Store, Google Play, Chrome. If, for example, the US government or the European government says, okay, we go harder on those vendors, and we try to censor them in a way, don't you think that this will impact the industry in a big way, meaning that a lot of users would stay away from crypto if it becomes more harder to use?
Yeah, it might. The thing is, you don't necessarily need lots and lots of your grandma to get into Bitcoin for Bitcoin to be useful. Like, there's a lot of people that use Bitcoin as savings. So even when it was very, very difficult to store Bitcoin back in 2013, there were people that were doing it. Now, does that mean that there will be less demand? Probably, because there are plenty of people that don't really understand how to do cold storage and so on. And if you have browsers or phones or something that are sort of censored or backdoored or something like that, they're just not going to trust it. But that said, this is the nice thing about an open protocol, as web pages, the entire internet is designed around these open protocols. I can make a browser. I mean, it would take me a while, but I can make a browser that interprets HTML and JavaScript and runs it on a thing without having Chrome or Firefox. And plenty of people do. There are lots of open source projects where the code for this stuff is available, and they will render browsers, web pages, and so on, and many other things. There are open sort of like app ecosystems where you can like sideload different application packages straight to your phone. So there are sort of like major hubs that the government can backdoor into or shut down or what have you. But if they do, then they're just sort of inviting more people to come to the open source side, which I think is great. Even Chrome has like Chromium, which is the open source version, and all the code is there. You can go make a fork of Chromium and make your own browser tomorrow if you wanted to. In fact, that's I think exactly what Brandon Eich did after he left Firefox. He made his own browser, Brave, based on Chromium, and changed a bunch of stuff and made it. So you can't stop people. You can stop companies, certainly, because they're very centralized and very vulnerable to government intervention. But you can't stop individuals from creating different things, and this is why open source is great. A lot of it's out there for free, and you can go fork it and change it and do whatever you want with it.
Great, thank you. This is very nice to hear. I also do believe that if they try to crack down on the Web2 layer, I mean, it will be a big test whether people are really concerned about the decentralization and censorship resistance and so on, and it will be very interesting to see in any way. Okay, so George, do you have something? I mean, while I check my other questions.
Well, I was thinking of another question, which is kind of a follow-up as to what you said. So you've been talking about like open source in terms of software, right? And that's absolutely growing. And I know you're again like you're playing your role in Bitcoin open source growing. Like the protocol developers being growing, you educating other programmers. But there's also, don't you think that we are kind of like in a need for open source hardware, right? Solutions, because Bitcoin nodes, devices that we use, whether it's mobile phones or laptops or computers, those can also be backdoors for malicious actors, right? Like I think it was like a couple of years ago, was that what was it, like the US banned Huawei's products, right? Bless you.
Thank you.
Exactly, because they suspected or found, I'm not really sure, such backdoors from the US government, so from the Chinese government. So this is kind of hard, right? Isn't it? Kind of like building censorship resistant hardware.
Well, so there's a couple of approaches that I think are pretty cool. So you have Spectre Wallet, which is a hardware wallet that's developed using sort of like commodity hardware. So what you do is you take these boards that are hobbyist boards for various reasons, but they're useful for all kinds of things, and they're very popular. You take that, add a couple of sensors for scanning a QR code or something like that, and maybe a little screen, and you 3D print the case, and next thing you know, you have a Bitcoin, and you load some firmware into it, and next thing you know, you have a Bitcoin wallet. And that's very hard to compromise unless you do that for every hobbyist board. And you have no idea which ones are going to get used for that purpose. So that's one approach, which is to use boards that are used in many different functions for the purposes of your thing. And a lot of Bitcoin nodes are similar. They'll use something like a Raspberry Pi with some hard drives, and then load the actual software into it. And using these multi-capable devices for your particular use case, it's harder to backdoor those because they're using open source software and the hardware is pretty much commoditized and so on. The other approach that I've seen that works pretty well also is, I think, like OpenDime and Block, they're working on this, where they'll publish the schematics of the hardware, and Open or Cold Card even has like a little green dot that does a checksum of the hardware and make sure that it hasn't been compromised, and you can see it when it lights up. It lights up green when the checksum passes, and is red if it's not. And Block, I think, is like publishing everything about their hardware wallet and making sure that it all goes through. There's also a really interesting project that I just read about, which is creating a private key and sort of like offline and generating the address, almost by hand, and that way, like, you don't have to trust the wallet at all, which in itself is kind of a crazy thing. But, so some form of that is also possible. And I imagine, like if you want to verify every step with respect to the hardware, that's the direction that you could go as well. So, I do agree, though, that like open source hardware it's a more difficult problem because it's hard to look at a chip unless you put it under an electron microscope or something, and know exactly what it does. Whereas with code, it's much easier. You know what's supposed to execute and so on. So, that's an argument, I guess, for more software wallets and put it on commodity hardware, which is less likely to have a backdoor.
George, let me jump with a question here. Jimmy, let's suppose that in 10 years' time, I mean, Bitcoin is very, very successful. Probably we see 10x price from here. It is widely used. Do you think that the more and more Bitcoin becomes successful, the harder it will be to address the necessary changes to it to evolve with society? Because society has different needs. Several years ago, we saw a big debacle on the increase of the block size of the protocol. I mean, there were various camps and so on. Don't you think that once the Bitcoin community becomes very big, it will become a victim of its own success, because it will be very slow to accept new changes, new vulnerabilities that might be found, etc.?
Well, I think it works fine just the way it is. There's this presumption that, okay, you always need new features in order to make it work better. That's not how money works. That's how technology works, and that's how like your phone works, right? You need new features or software or whatever. But for money, like, not changing is the main property that you want out of it. The problems that we're having with money right now is that it keeps changing. People keep printing more of it, and that makes it worth less. So doing anything to money actually makes it worse, because you have less predictability about its future. So, like the larger it gets, the community gets, and the more people use it, the more predictable it's going to be. It's actually going to be better for Bitcoin, because with money, like, if you can predict out from now, like, how much value you're going to have in it 10 years from now, how would that change, how you plan for the future? Part of why so many people sort of like live for today and go, like, spend all their money on drinking or, clubs or whatever, is because they have so much uncertainty going forward. And this is, obvious whenever there's any sort of like hyperinflation in any country. People just party it up because they're not going to save. Why would they save? Because they don't know how much it's going to be worth the next day. And if they do save, they're saving in something else, like a house or, commodities or something else. So for Bitcoin, like the ability to not change. I mean, if there are security vulnerabilities, I don't think there's going to be any problems getting those changes in. It's more like additional features and so on. You don't need additional features to keep Bitcoin useful. Now, all these altcoins and crypto, as you call it, those like depend on new narratives all the time and getting people to buy in. They are sort of vulnerable to the thing that you described, which is, they can't scale past a certain point. And you're seeing that in Ethereum right now, where like fees are insane or whatever. And they're trying to come up with some weird architecture that has all kinds of flaws in it. I mean, the way you solve a problem like that is you get more and more centralized, and that's what's been happening to Ethereum, is that over time it's gotten so centralized that they're like, okay, you know what? We got to throw this whole thing out and try again in Ethereum 2.0. That's the direction that these things go in. So, and to me, that's not any different than fiat money. It's not any different than a central bank. It's just a few people that control everything. And instead of printing money continuously, they just printed money at the beginning, in the form of a pre-mine or something. So it's not that crypto or altcoins have that vulnerability, but Bitcoin does not.
So don't you think that there might be different camps on Bitcoin politics in the future? Like, I mean, for example, we had this debacle, this big discussion about the block size, and there were many camps.
It was a war, not really a discussion.
Yeah,
people go with a war, right?
War. I mean, don't you think that we might reach another point in time where we face something similar?
Yeah, and guess what? That war was amazing for Bitcoin, because it let all of those people that disagreed leave peacefully. Now, all those coins have not done well at all. Like, if you look at something like BCH or BSV, those coins are doing horribly for a good reason, because they're centralized and they don't provide any value, and it's just a bunch of people that were belly aching on Bitcoin. So, the fact that they left has been fantastic. And you look at the price from when they left to now, how Bitcoin did versus how their coin did. Yeah, it's been fantastic. I want more wars. I want more of that. If you have a bad idea, like, go off and do it yourself, or and if it's a good idea, you'll be able to prove it to the market. That what I've seen, though, is that almost every single person that has gone off and done their own thing or created their own coin or whatever, they give up decentralization in order to add some new feature, and that is not a good trade-off. No one wins out of that. BCH centralized in order to get bigger blocks or whatever. That was not a good trade, and that's something I expect all of these projects to continue to have is. Essentially, like, they think that something is important, and they find out it's really not. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Jimmy, I'm curious, like, talking about other cryptocurrencies, like, because BCH and BSV, these are obviously sort of failed contestants of Bitcoin, right? For being money, right? But then you have other technologies, right? Like, you have smart contract platforms, you have stable coins, you have various sort of other technologies, honestly, like expanding. You have decentralized autonomous organizations. What the hell else you have? You have really a lot of permissionless, for the most extent, innovation going around the space. There's privacy coins as well, right? So I personally kind of like put those in a totally separate basket from Bitcoin. How do you look at them? Do you see some use cases, like actual use cases that can bring value to society outside of just, pure speculation?
Well, so I see them as pure speculation. And maybe there's some usefulness to something like Tether, which is essentially being a US dollar substitute, that doesn't that's under the control of some third-party entity instead of some branch of the U.S. government. But I mean, that's about it. Like everything else is just a way to get money from gullible people. That's what it's been, and it's kind of sad that so many people have fallen for it. But that's how it's been.
Okay, all right, cool. Another question I really wanted to bring to you, which has kept me sort of up at night sometime, is the security of Bitcoin against like a potential very malicious actor, right? So because theoretically, right, you have the global hash rate, miners that are mining for Bitcoin, right? And let's say today it is whatever is the hash rate. But theoretically, if you have like a very malicious actor, like let's say the US government, theoretically, or China, or some other government, they could, let's say, build up a hardware army of new miners, right, in one of those factories. They could spend a few tens of billions of dollars, which for them is nothing. They just put the printer, they print the money. They build those miners, they plug them into the electricity network, and all of a sudden, let's say they control 70, 80 or more % of the hash rate. I find this scenario like not super realistic, but also not completely unrealistic. Is this something you've ever thought of, like, or you think
like somebody owning a large percentage of the hash rate? Yeah, I've written like 5 articles on it. But basically, like the game theory works out that first of all, a lot more people will produce mining equipment. If this one miner is censoring a bunch of transactions, and that's really all they can do is prevent transactions from getting into the blockchain. Well, presumably they'll have high fees on them to try to get the miner to do it, but the miner won't. That means that more miners will come in to try to mine that transaction because there's more incentive to go do it. You earn more fees by mining that transaction. So the game theory works out where, okay, in order to censor transactions, you're actually having to give up money. You have to hurt yourself in order to hurt the network. Well, I mean, be my guest, try that, but you're going to lose to all your competitors. You might have 80% now, but if you're losing money, like by not mining the best ones, well, you're just giving your competitors a much bigger advantage. So I don't see that as any sort of threat. Like, even if it's like 90% in one entity and 10% in another, what will end up happening is that the 10% will mine those interesting transactions that are, that have high fees and so on. So, it might take longer, but it'll get through. And besides, like a lot of, sort of day-to-day transactions are happening on Lightning anyway. So, and those aren't really that affected. I mean, there are sort of like security scenarios and so on, but my analysis has been mostly that it doesn't really matter. You can try and it's first of all, it's not realistic that 90% of hashing power is in one entity or even 50%. Like the energy needed for that is not easy to get either, nor is the mining equipment. And there's always sort of like capitalist competition. It'd be like saying, oh, what if 90% of all food production was in one country? Like, not happening, right? Like that's about how realistic that is.
Jimmy, I want to ask you in relation to what you said. Do you think about any bad scenarios for Bitcoin? I mean, any scenarios that you're afraid of, something you're thinking is a threat to the Bitcoin network? What could that be? I mean, if you're looking into those.
Yeah, I mean, I've thought a lot about that for a while. I honestly, like a lot of the things that I thought would be scary actually have happened already. So, corporations sort of taking over Bitcoin, there being a hard fork and things like that. None of those things have actually hurt Bitcoin. And in fact, they've done really well for Bitcoin, at least if you look at the price, which is why, like, at this point, it's like not going to make any predictions about or say that I'm afraid of something, because the thing is, like, whatever I'm afraid of, if Bitcoin survives it, it's like double the price right away. Like that's generally how Bitcoin tends to go. In 2013, people thought that Bitcoin was just like darknet money or something. And when the Silk Road went down, they thought that it would crash in price because those were the only people using it. Turns out that wasn't the case, and Bitcoin went on like this amazing bull run from like $110 to 1,100. So in 6 weeks. You might come up with some pathological scenarios, but the thing is, they can be both, like whatever pathological scenario that you think might be bad for Bitcoin, if Bitcoin survives it, and it ends up being really good for Bitcoin. So, I hesitate to like sort of say, oh, I'm afraid of this. Yeah. I'm not, because Bitcoin's like sort of proven that it's very good at resisting all that.
Okay. Like you say, as time passes, it becomes becomes just stronger or more anti-fragile, right? Mm.
But so far, we haven't seen a currency that lasts forever, have we? Maybe it's Bitcoin.
Well, I mean, gold's lasted a pretty long time, and it's at least 5,000 years old. It's possible that its scarcity goes away if like a gold asteroid hits Earth or something. But I mean, I don't know. Like we'll see how long it lasts. I can tell you that it's way more durable than almost anything else, because it's bits on a disk, and it's in the abstract, and those have permanence.
Jimmy, what are you personally excited about in terms of Bitcoin products or Bitcoin upgrades to the protocol? Is there like a particular product or upgrade or something that you think is important?
I think it's really good right now. Taproot really hasn't sort of percolated through the entire ecosystem, so I'm looking forward to that becoming a bigger part of Bitcoin, because the capabilities are really cool. Like you can back up your stuff without any cost, really, and have these ways to not shoot yourself in the foot, which I think will be very important for users going forward. But Lightning continues to grow, so I'm pretty excited about that, and we'll see where that goes. And I look forward to NFTs and DeFi and all this other crap crashing to the ground.
Oh man, that although I kind of understand you, I think there's so much people who are just like looking for the quick win. And in that case, there's also like so many other more intelligent people who are able to to create shiny new coins.
I'm sure there are, but they are scamming, at least in my mind. So
yeah. Okay. Cool. Pretty cool. Mir, do you have other questions or?
Yeah. Now let's talk a little bit about the Bulgarian edition of the Little Bitcoin book. I mean, because we'll use this interview as a launchpad for the book, and George threw a lot of effort into translating this in the best way possible. So, I mean, Jimmy, what was the if you can relay one simple message to somebody who's hearing Bitcoin for the first time, what would that message be?
Think about what's going on in the world today with inflation and so on, and go read these books to understand what problem Bitcoin is solving. And once you understand that, then maybe you'll get into Bitcoin. thing is, like, a lot of people don't see Bitcoin as solving something, and if you don't see the problem first, then you're not going to understand it. So that's what I would point people to, is like, okay, there are these problems, how are you going to fix it?
Great, thank you.
All right. And so how did you write the book? Can you tell us a little about this, why and how, and who also, because it's not just you, right? There's a group of 7 authors, right?
8 authors total.
8 authors.
And there's a picture in the book of all of us that during our writing process, I think, in the book, which you can see here. And this was the 8 of us in a house in California, and we were basically like there for a week and figuring out how to write this book, and we wrote it in a week. It was a lot of fun, but yeah, it's people from all over the world, including Elena, who hooked me up with you guys. She's from the Czech Republic. We have Alejandro, who's from Venezuela. We have Timmy, who's from Nigeria. We have Luis, who's from the Philippines, and so on. So we had a pretty global cast when we wrote this. And the idea was to make an introduction that would appeal to a global audience. And I hopefully I've done that. You guys be the judge. You read it and, translated it and whatever. So, yeah.
It's a very nice book. It relays the message very softly and very simple, in a simple way. So more people can understand the attributes Bitcoin has and the problem it solves. So thank you, Jimmy.
You're welcome.
Absolutely. We'll make sure it gets to as many people as possible. Who is this book for?
It's for anyone that's curious about Bitcoin and doesn't really get it yet. And the idea being that you can understand it like just after reading the book, which I think you can finish in like under 2 hours. So that would be the idea.
Does it need a second version, a part 2, probably? Or
maybe we've talked about doing a second book or a revision or something, but we'll see where that goes.
Cool.
Indeed, actually, like the book, the cool thing about Bitcoin and how I don't know if it's that cool, like how the world has evolved in the past few years, but like as I read it for the first time, it was like, what was it, 2020, and just for a year or so many things have changed. And like if you look at what is it now, 2022. Like it has become just so much relevant, and there has been so many more vivid examples globally as to why Bitcoin matters so much. So it would indeed be cool to have an upgrade, I would say. But in any case, Jimmy, where can people find out more about you and kind of the things you do? How can people kind of engage with you or learn from you? Because you're really an educator, not just about writing books, because you have other books as well, but also teaching people how to code, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, you can find me on Twitter at Jimmy Song. My website is programmingbitcoin.com, and you can check out the different books I've written and the class I teach and stuff. There's also a newsletter, jimmysong.substack.com. So yeah, all those are available, and yeah, please subscribe.
And there's the Bitcoin Fixes This podcast, right? I've been listening to it.
That's part of my brand as well. I forget sometimes all the stuff I do. So there's a column I'm writing for Bitcoin Magazine and stuff too. So yeah, lot of different things going on. Search my name, Jimmy Song Bitcoin. I'm sure you find it.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you so much for your time. This has been really a pleasure. Yeah.
Thank you, Jimmy, and wish you well.
All right, great.
Jimmy, you're going to Miami, right?
I am.
You'll be leading classes?
Yeah, I'm doing the class 1 week from today, and then